There are some technical terms in cybersecurity that you really have to know how to use correctly in talking to colleagues, news agencies, so on, to make sure you use them in the technical sense that they're used in this industry. Asset, threat, threat agent, vulnerability, exploit, and risk. So let's move through those. The asset is simply something of value that you wish to protect. Now, later on, as we go into risk assessment, vulnerability analysis, things like that, we'll look at how we categorize assets. We have very critical assets, we have non-critical assets. Typically, data and proprietary software are the most critical assets that we're concerned with because they're irreplaceable. You can't necessarily replace your data. If you have internal proprietary software and it's lost, you can't replace that easily. If it's external software, such as commercial software, yes, you can replace that. Hardware you can replace. Those are non-critical, but data and proprietary software are usually critical. The threat is the bad thing that could happen to an asset. So it could get stolen or leaked. You could lose records such as financial records. You could violate your legal obligations. There are certain legal obligations to retain some kinds of data for certain periods of time in case there's some external investigation that needs to be made by financial agencies, law enforcement, and so on. And so if we lose that data, then we are in violation of our legal obligations. So those are lots of kinds of things that are bad things that could happen to our assets. The threat agent is the one that could carry out that threat. So we usually think of external hackers right away. We think of those people out there trying to steal our customers' credit card numbers. But actually, most threats are carried out by internal employees, not necessarily maliciously, often non-maliciously, just by accident or just ignorance. Contractors is something we have to take into account. And then we have some external things such as power losses, floods and earthquakes, equipment failure, obsolescence is a big one. A lot of storage media that we used to use, it's hard to find the equipment anymore to read that storage media. So obsolescence actually becomes something of real concern in the field of cybersecurity. Vulnerability is simply a weakness in a system that makes that threat possible. A weak password is a vulnerability. Poor programming is a vulnerability. This often occurs in web forms that are not properly put together so that there are ways to penetrate a system through a web form. Protocol weaknesses. So, for example, the DNS system has certain weaknesses in it that we have to shore up and use other methods in order to make it stronger. The original DNS system didn't really have security built into it. Insufficient physical security, not putting locks on your doors, for example. Poor policies and practices. Human error, of course, is one big weakness that we have to look out for so that we can shore up our systems and not allow a human error to make it foolproof. An exploit really has a couple of definitions. It's the method by which a threat is actually carried out or the actual carrying out of a threat. So when you talk about something like the denial of service attack, that would be the exploit, the denial of service attack. We could be talking about it generically as something that could happen, or we could be talking about the actual carrying it out. A system virus, a ransomware attack, those are all types of exploits. Finally, we have the risk. A risk is really a combination of things. In normal everyday speech, we think of risk as the likelihood. What is the risk that something bad is going to happen? Well, how likely is it that it's going to happen? But we also have to combine that with the level of damage that it could cause if it does happen. And I've put together this little table here that this is not exactly how it's done necessarily when we do risk analysis, but it's one way that it could be done. If we have a very low likelihood, let's just say that I assign the likelihood of something happening by percentage. There's a 10% chance or a 20% chance or an 80% chance or a 90% chance that something could happen. And then the damage potential if it does happen. If I have, say, a low loss, I'll just assign it a 1, and a high loss, I'll assign it a high number like an 8 or a 9. And then if I multiply those numbers together, I can kind of get a level of risk. It's very unlikely, and the damage, if it does happen, is very low. It would have a very low value over here. However, if the likelihood is very, very likely, I've given it a 9 here, and if it does happen, it would be very, very bad, then I will give it a very high number over here. So the 81 here represents a very high risk. And so you can see that the level of risk is sort of a sliding scale here of combinations of the likelihood and how much damage it could do if it does happen. Mitigating a risk is a little bit more complex than just saying, well, I'll get rid of that risk. I'll do something to make that risk go away. You can't really make risk go away. Some risk is always going to be inevitable, and there are different ways to deal with it. Things like insurance, for example, or I can actually try to mitigate the risk by decreasing that risk. I can either decrease the likelihood or I can decrease the level of damage. Decreasing either one is going to lower that risk. Or I might just accept the risk. Very low likelihood, low damage if it does happen, then why throw a lot of money at it and a lot of time at it? So I might accept it. Well, we'll deal with that in a later discussion. There are lots of different ways to deal with risk if a risk is revealed to us. So there we go. We have these terms: asset, threat, threat agent, vulnerability, exploit, and risk, and you really should know how to use these terms, how to navigate them properly.